Welcome back to another episode of Creative Finance Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Jenn.
I'm Joe.
And we are really excited to dive into this topic today where we're going to get a little vulnerable. We're going to share with you some big lessons that we've learned on a recent creative finance deal where we lost $30,000, which should have been a perfect deal, but we're hoping to share this with you so you learn from some of the mistakes that we've made and you won't have to make them as well.
Well, and this was like we thought originally the perfect deal because a woman reached out to us. She had a turnkey condo. She lived in it. It was built outside of Boston. It was built in 2008, and she was living there the first, 7, 8 years. And then she was going to move, and she was thinking about putting it on the market, but the market dropped. So she decided she's just going to rent it out. She wasn't a landlord, so what we call her is an accidental landlord. She was not in the real estate business, but now she's got this rental property. So she was getting to the point where the renters that she put in there, she's like, I should have had, listened to my gut feeling. But in Massachusetts, I don't know if that's even allowed, right? So what happened was she puts in the renter, they move in, almost right away, they both quit their jobs. And right away, they're making all of the excuses of why they can't pay rent. And so now she wants to sell it. Free and clear condo. So we're going to talk about how we lost $30,000 on this deal that we bought a turnkey condo with only $5,000 down, and we had a 1.5% interest rate.
Yeah, because this seller owned this property outright free and clear. So there was no mortgage on the property. But at this point, what she was hoping would be like her nest egg, her retirement fund, she realized pretty quickly into this transaction with these tenants that that was just not happening. And so I think she even tried to list it on market at one point, and they wouldn't let them come through or something. So we definitely had a motivated seller. And the interesting thing about this seller, too, I remember, is that she was talking to a couple different investors, and we really connected well because of our strategy of Facebook marketing and putting a lot out there onto our Facebook platforms of showing who we are. And she even commented like, oh, your wife likes to cook because I share recipes.
Well, and that was the point. She saw our branding, which doesn't cost anything. It's free. It's on Facebook, right? So we created the Jenn Buys 585 Facebook page. So, of course, people are going to want to go check you out. So we give them plenty to go see. And on your page, they're sharing how we bought houses. We've helped out sellers. There's pictures of you and us as the family. And then there's, tons of, people's houses that we've bought them, and then they're giving us a good review. There was recipes that you're sharing. So she felt comfortable because I know when I had the talk with her, she's like, some of these other investors that she's talking to, like one guy, his Facebook was completely locked and it was just an avatar. She's like, I don't know who I'm even dealing with. So if you're listening to this, you need to make sure that you're doing a little bit of a Facebook audit on your own page and make sure that there's like stuff on there. Give them something to see. It's not really that hard. It's free. It doesn't cost any money. It's just some marketing and it goes a long way. Branding yourself, right? And you do that consistently. But she fell in love with your Facebook page and said, yep, let's go ahead and make a deal. A lot of the other investors were offering her like 50 cents on the dollar. And she's like, I am not selling this thing and just giving it away. This was almost like a retirement like nest egg to her. So when we made the deal, part of the trouble was, so big major key number one was where you buy makes all of the big difference. Location, location, location. And it's like rule number one with real estate. So our big thing was, well, there's many times where I can buy and inherit a tenant. The property, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to close on it, and I get the tenant. Many of these deals that we've done, the tenant's either going to be great and they're going to move out shortly, or they just stay there even longer. So that's fine. But we had some really bad renters in this place. According to the eviction attorney and the courts and all the different Zoom courts that I've been on, they were the 1 in a million. Luckily, we were the ones that got that, right?
Or unfortunately.
I know. So what happened was we make the deal. I've talked to the renter before then. We offered them what's called cash for keys. And I see people talk about this on Facebook, like, oh, just offer them $1,000 and they're going to leave. Well, that's not that easy.
Yeah, and if some people out there are saying that, like, let's see their track record, because I don't really think any of our processes that we've ever done were like they've just taken cash for keys.
No. And we've offered it every time.
And so this is in Massachusetts, which I'm going to admit, I went in like tooting my own horn. I've had a couple of evictions in New York. I know how to play their game, quote unquote. And I was pretty confident that we were going to help this older seller who just did not have the gumption, really, like the drive to like deal with the shenanigans. I was like, we've got this. Like, no way is this going to take, more than a couple of months, I thought. Boy, was I wrong.
Holy cow. So I spoke to the renter before we closed. He's like, oh, yeah, she's such a jerk. She calls me all the time. I'm like, well, you haven't paid rent in 3 years. Maybe that's a big indicator of why she's calling you every day, but that's nonetheless, right? So, it was always like good cop, bad cop. I felt like I was the good cop relating to the
non-paying tenant.
I was going to say criminal, but yep. Okay. And then the flip side of that was, the previous owner, she was the bad cop. She was the one harassing them for rent money all the time. So I said, yeah, right. So I was like, you know what? When I buy the property and I close on it, we'll work something out. I'll help you get back on your feet. I'll even give you some cash to move out because I'm going to need this place vacant. He was, in the beginning, he was so, oh, this is great. Oh, absolutely. Life was fine. Mm-hmm. We go close on the property. And I remember being in Massachusetts. We were in Boston. And we're calling him and like, hey, this is me. We just closed on the property. Now we got to get you, find out where you're going to go. This was in July of 2023. Well, he says, no problem, Joe. I don't want my daughter going to this school district anyways. We're going to be out by August.
Yeah, he was playing us from the beginning.
From the beginning, professional. So where I'm going with this is why location matters is because in certain states, it is extremely hard to do an eviction or remove squatters or non-paying tenants. In some states, it is so hard. There are some states where, my gosh, there's somebody squatting your property. You call the sheriff's department, they show up with a shotgun and throwing everybody out. Well, maybe not quite, but if it seems like that, right? So in this circumstance, we thought, well, we did this in New York. We've already been through this. There's really not a harder state to do business in New York.
So we thought.
Until we bought a property in Massachusetts. Now that is on my list of like, oh boy.
Yeah. And looking back too, I didn't look through the exact, the laws and regulations of what we should have properly done. I thought, okay, we'll just hire our eviction attorney, we get him on our side, and we just follow protocol. But as we went further down the road, we realized that there were several things that we should have done, and I forget exactly what they were at the moment. I don't know if you remember, but
there was tons, right?
There was all of these things that just all of a sudden came up, but like months later. So hindsight, we did hire our eviction attorney to start that ball rolling. And I think it was like by August, September when we realized this guy was not going to move. Mm-hmm. And so, mind you, I think we started paying the seller her monthly.
Well, you missed one key component. In August, so this is a month and a half later, I reached out. I'm like, hey, you plan on being out of this property for September so your daughter could get into the right school district, and it's end of August. Like, what's going on? And this is where the attitude changed 180. I mean, I'm telling you some of these text messages that they sent me.
Oh, they're vulgar. Yeah, he was
extremely vulgar. So I can't imagine this little lady trying to deal with this guy on her own. He was the 1 in a million bad renter. Mm-hmm. So what happened was we had to hire an attorney. We started going to court. We're doing these courts on Zoom.
And we're spending hours filling out this paperwork. And I distinctly remember it was the day after Christmas last year. And I was trying to figure things out with the attorney. And I was in tears. I was all upset, trying to do all the right things here. And he was basically telling us then, oh, I don't know, guys, this might not be anything. And I just remember feeling super frustrated that early on.
Right. And it was going to be, once we found out, going through the process, so here's some of the things that were happening in the time frame, not terribly long, but I mean, we would have a court date on Zoom. They wouldn't show up. I'd be on a Zoom waiting for court for 2 hours, 3 hours, missing meetings and calls. And I'm sitting there waiting in this waiting room on Zoom with all these other people. And then the bad renter wouldn't show up. Then all of a sudden they had to go to an emergency room for something. They got a doctor's notice for, their fingernail when they cut it.
The child had a fever and they proved it by showing a photo of the thermometer having a high temperature.
Yep.
Which, I mean, you could run underwater and that could happen, but neither here nor there. So it was literally every little thing. Like they knew how to play the system. And
Oh, they were professional.
they were, yeah.
Well, then come to find out, to take it a step further, what they were doing was, we live in Florida, properties in Massachusetts. Every time we've ever done an eviction in New York, they were just like, we pay the attorney goes, does all this stuff. I never had to go to court. I never had to be there to do anything. Massachusetts is different. They were allowing it to be on Zoom, but then what the tenant was doing, which was pretty clever on their part, so if this is happening to you, beware, they would accidentally not show up to the court because of something happened. My car broke down and I couldn't come. My kid was in the emergency room or urgent care because, whatever. So they couldn't come. So he says, well, you know what? It's not fair that Joe lives out of state. I want him to fly up here. And he's telling this to the judge. And the judge is like, well, yeah, you should be here for court. I'm like, why? So I could fly to Massachusetts from Florida. I could sit in this waiting room just to find out they don't show up again because somebody had a cold or a hangnail or something. I'm like, not doing that.
Right.
So it was definitely a big, big, big learning experience. So not all creative deals are created equally. There's going to be times where so one of my big rules, if I'm inheriting a tenant, I need to see a copy of the lease. I need to know that they're paying on time.
Yeah, I want proof of payment. I'm going to want to see that they are in cooperation, that payments are being made wherever they're collecting the rent, because we have inherited tenants who have been paying, and then
the one we did in Williston,
Yeah,
the lady was great.
absolutely.
She took great care of the property. She was thrilled that we were able to give her as much time as she needed until she found her next property, because we didn't offer rent to own.
And that's where I'm like, we need to tell people about this, because it looks like, it's so easy to get a seller to say yes, and sometimes it's not, right? But in this case, the seller did say yes. She gave us a 1.5 1.5% interest rate. On paper, everything was beautiful, but we paid her, we paid attorneys, we spent a lot of our time, and honestly, the stress levels that it was creating for me,
level 10,
it was just horrendous. And then on top of it, I just felt like we were also failing the seller. And that was such a defeating moment for me, because I really thought we were going to be the good guys and come in and remove this non-paying tenant. But it was almost like there was really no winning in the situation. So,
and if you remember, we offered cash for keys. I first came in with $5,000. I wanted it to be a number that was so big that these people who don't have jobs were going to see $5,000 and be like, oh my gosh, let's take that. But then I thought about it. If they haven't paid rent in 3 years and they move out, then they're going to have to start paying rent again. And they know how to work the system. So if they move out, $2,000 in the city of Boston gets you 2 months, 3 months tops worth of rent.
Yeah.
That's it. Right. So after that, their money would have been gone. They realize that they're going to be able to stay there for multiple years after going to court. And for over a year of doing this, when I talked to the judge and the attorney, they said they still might be in this property for 1 to 2 more years longer. An eviction, because we inherited a bad tenant, could be 2 to 3 years to get them removed.
To kind of backpedal a little bit too, is we're trying so hard. Well, what are the things we need to do? And this laundry list, if you remember, comes back, and they're like, you need to replace all this flooring because there was a cracked tile, and they claim that their kids' pajamas had holes in their feet. And I'm like, my kids had holes in their pajamas. They run around on their feet on the bare floor. And so it was literally weird little things like that, but they use it against you in the court systems, and it really sets people like us
and
up.
The cracked tiles were behind the toilet.
I know.
Behind the toilet. It wasn't unless your kid is walking behind a toilet that's up against the wall, what are their pajama bottoms doing getting ripped up back there?
And so beside that point, we were trying to coordinate with contractors to get into the property. And how many times were they not home? They wouldn't let them in. They let them in, and they were just the contractors telling us, no, I'm not going to be able to finish this job. These people are crazy, because they didn't want to get involved with it.
They were finding drug paraphernalia at the house.
Yeah.
So obviously we knew then at that point what we were dealing with. And you've got little kids in this house.
I know. That was a really sad part too.
So hard. So part of the fun things about real estate is, we get to help a lot of people, but then also on the flip side of that, you come across some really
red flags and
heart-wrenching situations, especially when it involves kids. I think of one of the properties that we bought in New York, and they had kids living in there. And once they moved out, because it was an eviction, we looked at the property after, and I couldn't believe kids were living in this type of stuff. So, it really does strike a chord with me. especially I know with you too. But so these are some really big eye openers. So what are the takeaways for this today? If you're going to buy a property, I want it to be vacant at closing. Like I need it to be vacant at closing. For some reason, if I'm going to buy it and I'm going to inherit a tenant that's coming with it, I need to make sure that everything is good. I need to make sure that the tenant is paying on time, they're not disgruntled, the property's in decent shape. A lot of times I like to interview the renter because they've been living there. So they're going to say, oh, well, she never fixed the ceiling or whatever that could be. So it's good to meet the tenant before you even, before you make the deal. Moving forward, and that's going to be a deal breaker. So if I have a property in some of the more states that are not as landlord friendly, I'm not going to inherit a tenant. I will help them with the eviction process. I could help put the seller in touch with an attorney who could help with the eviction process. But what I've learned is that once you buy it, whatever they've already done, it goes back to zero again.
That was the other kicker is no matter what we've now done, it would just go back to zero. And whatever she had done didn't matter where we picked up. So you just start at square one every single time there's a new owner.
Yeah. So big lessons. Landlord friendly states, depending on the state, could be a little bit easier. I know we live in Florida, and for squatters, this is something different. But if you've squatted in Florida, you could legitimately call the sheriff's department and they come throw them out. I mean, it has changed in Florida. But it's also, you hear other states like California. If you get a squatter that moves into your house, you might as well almost give them the property because they could be there for so long. So this is definitely some red flags. So if you're dealing with landlords, whether they're a professional landlord or an accidental landlord where they just have a property and they just started renting it and they're not really going into being a landlord, you want to make sure if you're buying the property from them, you know what's going on with the tenant, interview the tenant, make sure that you know the tenant eviction laws of that state if it's coming to be an issue. You got to get a new lease signed from the beginning. That was one of our downfalls. We didn't have a new lease. But also, too, he wasn't going to sign a new lease. He wasn't even paying rent. I'm going to take a little bit of a shot here, but when he went to court, there was an old lease that they showed, and he didn't even know the amount of rent he was supposed to pay because he didn't pay rent in 3 years.
Right.
So he says, oh, my rent was this. No, it wasn't. It was a completely different number. So you're dealing with professionals, and there's many people. I think people overall are good. I love people. That's always one of my favorite things, meeting people and find out what makes them tick. But there's always some turds out there too. So you just have to be mindful of who you're doing business with. That makes a big difference.
And just know that when you're getting into real estate, yes, we talk a lot about buying with little to no money down, but you've got to have reserves. You've got to have some capital to just fall back on, because here we went a little while for, we went into it $5,000 down to her, we paid closing costs, and then we had our monthly payment to her.
And we had attorney fees.
And then we were pretty diligent with that. And I just remember we finally got to the point where we had that conversation with her of hey, Mrs. Seller, we've got to figure this out because our attorney is telling us this is not looking good. And so we had that difficult conversation, and I know she was frustrated because we were also frustrated, but it was fairly simple. We just claimed the deed back to her. And I say fairly simple because there was a couple emails that went back and forth. But, at the end of the day, it's off of our books. And
she listed it with an agent.
She did. I think
they
she was able to sell
it
it
as is. And so somebody bought it, inheriting
Somebody is now dealing with bad renter.
I'm not going to say your first name, but if you're listening, you know who you are. Okay, but that's really the point of this. So,
but you come out. I want to say, we're still standing. It totally sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. A lot of tears, a lot of frustrations, and it was a loss. But with that loss were so many valuable lessons learned. And if someone can kind of take anything that we're saying to heart and just know that, even if you think you have a superhero cape, we're all human, and there's really only so much we can do.
And some of the biggest lessons that I feel that I've always learned are, obviously the wins are great and everybody wants a high five and there's always a bunch of that stuff going on, but your biggest wins are from your losses, or your biggest wins, your biggest lessons, are from your losses. And so here's the deal with this podcast today. You're going to learn the most amount of value from people's losses. Use other people's losses for your own benefit, right? So I know part of when we had our coach, he'd always be like, well, don't do this and don't do that. You know how I know? Because this is what happened to me. And I'm like, oh, good. Like, I don't need to learn the lesson twice, right? I've already learned it once because you made that mistake. And that's a part of coaching. And I think that's why it's really important to have a good coach, mentor, somebody who's done this tons of times, who's been through this. They kind of give you that like tap on the shoulder and be like, hey, slow down. I know it looks great, but maybe there's a little bit more behind the curtain we need to, look at before we just dive right into that next deal. Because I'll tell you what, on paper, boy, that deal looks so darn good. I was in love with the property. I was in love with the area. I was in love with the deal until one little thing happens, right? So big keys, big takeaways. And this is why we come on here and share our wins, but we also need to share our losses too, because it's real life stuff. And guys, as much as everybody likes to sugarcoat it on social media, this is real life stuff. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, make sure you drop them below or come over to our Facebook community group. We love being able to connect with everybody over there. Creative Finance Playbook, Jenn and Joe. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, make sure that you go give us a review and tell us what you enjoy listening to, because we are here for you. We want you to be able to get the best out of the real estate investing without credit, without banks, and learn, like we said, from us what we did or did not do. So,
and if you want to also get like how we find these sellers, right on our website, Creative Finance Playbook is the key, guys, to generating incoming leads for free organically without spending any money. And yes, paid stuff works, but my gosh, you could get as much leads as you want for free just by this one strategy that really changed our lives and so many other people's too. And so creativefinanceplaybook.com. Also on there is the script, the 10 magic questions that we ask every seller to where they actually make us the offer. So if you want to learn more about how that works, go to creativefinanceplaybook.com. And if you want to learn more about our coaching program and get to see like how to get your hands held through this whole process yourself so you don't feel like you're doing it alone, reach out. We'd love to connect. My cell phone number, my actual cell phone number is 585-207-2240. And you could call me or text me. Don't be surprised when I answer, because I will, or I will text you back and we can set up a call and see if there's a way we could help.
Until next time, go do some deals.
See you guys.